The morning of September 15th started like every bride's dream. Golden sunlight streaming through the bridal suite windows at Oakwood Country Club, my dress hanging perfectly pressed against the mahogany armoire, and the soft chatter of my bridesmaids getting ready around me. Amy, my maid of honor since college, was carefully arranging the blush pink roses in my bouquet, while my sister Jessica curled her hair in the corner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everything looked picture perfect, like something straight out of a wedding magazine. But dreams have a way of turning into nightmares when your mother decides your wedding day is the perfect stage for her performance. The first red flag should have been when Linda walked into the bridal suite 30 minutes late, carrying a garment bag with the smuggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. She kissed my cheek like nothing was wrong, complimented my makeup artist's work, and then casually mentioned she'd brought a little surprise for the ceremony. I should have known something was off when she refused to show me her dress during any of our shopping trips. Every time I asked, she'd wave her hand dismissively and say she wanted it to be a surprise. I thought she meant a beautiful surprise. The kind where your mother looks elegant and radiant standing beside you on your special day. I thought she meant the good kind of surprise. The garment bag unzipped with a sound that still makes my stomach drop 2 years later. Inside was a dress that made every woman in the room go silent. Not the comfortable silence of admiration, but the heavy, suffocating silence of collective shock. It was white. Not cream, not ivory, not champagne, or any of those acceptable mother-of-the-bride colors that dance around the edges of white without crossing the line. It was pure bridal white with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that screamed bride louder than my own dress. Amy's curling iron clattered against the marble countertop. Jessica's mouth fell open so wide I could see her dental work. Even Monica, our wedding planner who'd handled hundreds of ceremonies and claimed she'd seen everything, stood frozen with a bobby pin halfway to her mouth, like someone had hit pause on a remote control. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and Linda, sensing she had our complete attention, smoothed the dress against her body and turned toward the full-length mirror. She admired herself like she was the star of the show, adjusting the neckline and fluffing the skirt with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what kind of bomb she'd just dropped into my morning. Amy found her voice first, though it came out higher and more strained than usual. She asked Linda if she was sure about the color choice, her tone walking the careful line between diplomacy and disbelief. Linda laughed, the kind of tinkling laugh she used when she thought someone was being ridiculous, and said it was the most beautiful dress she'd ever owned. She'd found it on sale at Nordstrom and simply couldn't resist. She mentioned how the salesperson had complimented her figure and told her she looked like a bride herself. I stood there in my silk robe, my hair half done and my stomach churning, trying to process what was happening. This was my mother, the woman who'd taught me about appropriate wedding etiquette, who'd spent months discussing every detail of the ceremony with me, who knew better than anyone alive that wearing white to someone else's wedding was the ultimate act of disrespect. Yet here she was, defending her choice like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jessica tried to intervene, suggesting maybe Linda had brought a backup dress, something in navy or burgundy that would photograph beautifully. Linda's expression shifted then, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal something cold underneath. She said she wasn't changing clothes for anyone, that she'd spent good money on this dress and intended to wear it. She reminded us that she was paying for half the wedding, so she deserved to look her best. The money comment hit like a slap. It was true that Linda had contributed financially to the wedding, but it had always been framed as a gift, a loving gesture from a mother who wanted her daughter's day to be perfect. Now it was being wielded like a weapon, a transaction that came with strings attached and conditions I'd never agreed to. Amy stepped closer to me, her protective instincts kicking in the way they had throughout our friendship. She asked if I wanted her to call my dad, maybe get him to talk some sense into Linda. But I knew Robert wouldn't intervene. He'd learned years ago that fighting with Linda only made things worse, and he'd developed a talent for disappearing whenever conflict arose. He was probably already at the church, adjusting his tie and practicing his walk down the aisle, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in the bridal suite. The makeup artist, a sweet woman named Diane who'd been doing wedding makeup for 20 years, quietly packed up her brushes and said she'd come back when things settled down. Even she could sense this wasn't normal mother-daughter wedding day jitters. This was something darker, more intentional. Linda began getting dressed then, right there in front of all of us, sliding into the white dress like she was claiming territory. The fabric fit her perfectly, hugging her curves in all the right places. And I realized with growing horror that this wasn't an impulsive purchase. This dress had been altered. The hem was the exact right length, the waist taken in to her measurements. She'd planned this for weeks, maybe months. As she zipped herself up, Linda started talking about the ceremony, mentioning how she hoped the photographer would get some good shots of her during the processional. She wondered aloud if people would comment on how young and beautiful she looked, how she could practically pass for the bride herself. The words felt like needles under my skin, each comment designed to draw attention away from me and onto her. Amy suggested, with barely controlled anger in her voice, that maybe Linda could save the dress for another occasion, perhaps a nice dinner or theater event. Linda's response was swift and cutting. She said Amy should focus on her own appearance instead of worrying about what other people wore. She pointed out that Amy's dress was a little tight around the hips, and maybe she should have ordered a size up. The cruelty of that comment hung in the air like smoke. Amy had been struggling with her weight lately, stressed from her job and a recent breakup, and Linda had gone straight for her biggest insecurity. It was a masterclass in manipulation, deflecting criticism by attacking the critic where it would hurt most. Jessica tried a different approach, appealing to Linda's sense of tradition and propriety. She mentioned how Grandma Rose had always emphasized the importance of letting the bride shine on her wedding day, how our grandmother would be rolling over in her grave if she saw this. Linda's face hardened at the mention of her mother-in-law, and she said that Grandma Rose had been dead for 5 years and wouldn't be giving fashion advice to anyone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Even for Linda, who had a talent for saying hurtful things, this was particularly cold. Grandma Rose had been the family matriarch, beloved by everyone, and invoking her memory just to dismiss it felt like sacrilege. Monica, trying to salvage what was left of the morning, suggested we move forward with hair and makeup so we could stay on schedule. The ceremony was in 3 hours, and we still had photographs to take before the guests arrived. She'd clearly dealt with difficult family dynamics before and was trying to minimize the damage, but even her professional cheerfulness couldn't mask the tension crackling through the room. As my hairstylist worked around the chaos, carefully pinning each curl into place, I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror. I looked pale, shaken, like someone who'd just witnessed an accident. This was supposed to be the happiest morning of my life, the culmination of 14 months of planning and dreaming. Instead, it felt like I was getting ready for a funeral. Linda, now fully dressed and admiring herself from every angle, began offering unsolicited advice about my appearance. She suggested I might want more blush since I looked washed out, recommended a different lipstick shade that would complement her dress better, and wondered if my hair might look nicer in a lower style that wouldn't compete with her own updo. Every suggestion was a tiny knife, designed to chip away at my confidence and redirect attention to her. I realized with growing clarity that this wasn't about a dress at all. This was about control, about making sure that even on my wedding day, Linda remained the center of attention. The white dress was just the most visible symbol of her need to dominate every situation. Amy pulled me aside while Linda was in the bathroom, touching up her lipstick and taking selfies in the mirror. She asked if I wanted her to handle this, maybe get some of the other family members involved to talk Linda down. But I knew it was too late for that. The guests would start arriving soon. Michael would be waiting at the altar, and changing the entire dynamic now would only create more drama. Instead, I made a decision that would haunt me for months afterward. I decided to let it happen. I told myself I was being the bigger person, that focusing on Linda's behavior would only give her more of what she wanted. I convinced myself that people would see right through her attention-seeking and judge her accordingly. I thought I could rise above it and still have a beautiful wedding day. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was absolutely right about one thing. This marriage wasn't going to last. Not because Linda had some supernatural ability to predict the future, but because her behavior that day revealed something fundamental about the family dynamics I was marrying into, and Michael's response to it told me everything I needed to know about the man I was about to pledge my life to. The white dress was just the beginning. The ceremony itself unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. As we lined up for the processional, Linda positioned herself strategically at the front of the family section, making sure everyone could see her white dress in all its glory. The gasps from the congregation were audible even over the organ music. I watched from the back of the church as heads turned, whispers spread, and cell phones appeared like wildflowers after rain. Michael stood at the altar looking confused and increasingly uncomfortable as his relatives began murmuring among themselves. His mother, Carol, dressed appropriately in navy blue, kept glancing between Linda and me with an expression that shifted from bewilderment to outright horror. Even Pastor Williams, who'd officiated hundreds of weddings at St. Mary's, seemed momentarily thrown off his rhythm as Linda made her grand entrance. But Linda was in her element. She walked down that aisle like she was floating on air, nodding graciously at the guests, pausing to hug relatives who looked too stunned to resist. She'd positioned herself perfectly to be in every processional photograph, ensuring that years from now, when people looked at my wedding pictures, they'd see her in that white dress dominating the frame. When my turn finally came to walk down the aisle with my father, I felt like I was moving through a dream. Robert's arm was steady under mine, but I could feel his tension in the way he held himself rigidly upright. He'd seen Linda's dress for the first time when we'd gathered for photos, and the color had drained from his face so completely I thought he might faint. But true to form, he said nothing, just squeezed my hand and told me I looked beautiful. The ceremony proceeded according to script, but there was an undercurrent of electricity in the air that had nothing to do with romance. I could see people's attention drifting between Michael and me at the altar and Linda in the front row, who seemed to be performing her own version of the wedding ceremony. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief during the vows, not because she was moved by the moment, but because she wanted everyone to see how emotional and beautiful she looked while crying. During the exchange of rings, Linda audibly sighed and shook her head, just loud enough for the people around her to notice. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone had any reason why Michael and I shouldn't be married, Linda actually shifted in her seat, like she was considering standing up. The pause that followed felt eternal, and I saw Michael's eyes widen with panic. But the moment that crystallized everything came during the Unity Candle ceremony. As Michael and I each lit our individual candles and moved toward the central flame, Linda suddenly stood up from her seat, not to object to the marriage, but to get a better view for the photographs she was taking with her phone. The rustle of her white dress drew every eye in the church, and for a moment that should have been about Michael and me joining our lives together, all anyone could focus on was my mother making herself the center of attention. The photographer, a consummate professional named Dave, who'd shot weddings for 15 years, tried his best to work around the chaos. But every formal shot included Linda somewhere in the frame, either deliberately photobombing or positioning herself so prominently that cropping her out would ruin the composition. When he tried to take pictures of just Michael and me, Linda would call out helpful suggestions about our poses, or remind us to smile bigger. The receiving line after the ceremony was where Linda truly hit her stride. As guests filed past to congratulate us, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She stationed herself right beside me, accepting compliments on her dress and thanking people for their kind words about how young and radiant she looked. Several elderly relatives, clearly confused by the situation, actually congratulated her on her upcoming nuptials before realizing their mistake. Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor from childhood, pulled me aside during the receiving line and whispered that she'd never seen anything quite like it. She asked if there had been some kind of miscommunication about the dress code, if perhaps Linda had misunderstood and thought she was supposed to wear white. I found myself making excuses for her, explaining that she'd been so excited about the wedding that she'd perhaps gotten carried away with her outfit choice. Even as I defended her, I could hear how hollow the words sounded. There was no miscommunication, no innocent mistake. Linda had known exactly what she was doing, and she was succeeding beyond her wildest dreams. Every conversation at the cocktail hour seemed to circle back to her dress, her bold choice, her stunning appearance. My wedding had become a referendum on Linda's behavior, and she was loving every minute of it. Michael finally pulled me aside during the cocktail hour, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He asked what the hell was going on with my mother, why she was dressed like a bride at our wedding. His voice was sharp with frustration, and I realized this was the first time he'd really confronted the reality of my family's dysfunction. During our engagement, I'd tried to shield him from Linda's more dramatic tendencies, downplaying her need for attention and making excuses for her behavior. I tried to explain that this was just how Linda was, that she had trouble letting other people have the spotlight, that we should ignore her and focus on celebrating our marriage. But Michael wasn't buying it. He pointed out that his relatives were asking him questions he couldn't answer, that people were taking pictures of Linda instead of us, that our wedding photographer was struggling to get shots that didn't include my mother posing dramatically in the background. The conversation escalated quickly, with Michael suggesting that someone needed to ask Linda to change clothes or at least tone down her performance. I defended her again, saying it was too late to make a scene, that addressing it now would only create more drama. But even as I said it, I could feel something shifting between us. Michael was seeing my family clearly for the first time, and he was realizing what he'd signed up for. The reception at Oakwood Country Club's grand ballroom was when Linda's behavior reached its crescendo. During the cocktail hour, she'd positioned herself near the entrance to greet guests as they arrived, playing hostess like it was her party. She'd already had several glasses of champagne, and her inhibitions were rapidly disappearing, along with her minimal sense of propriety. When Monica announced that dinner was being served, Linda somehow managed to be seated at the head table, despite the carefully planned seating chart that placed her with the other parents at a table nearby. She claimed there had been a mix-up with the place cards and settled herself between Michael's best man and the pastor, where she could be prominently featured in all the toasts and speeches. Michael's best man, a soft-spoken accountant named Tom, looked completely overwhelmed as Linda dominated the conversation during dinner. She regaled the table with stories about her own wedding day, comparing every detail of our celebration to hers and generally finding ours lacking. The flowers weren't as elegant, the music wasn't as sophisticated, the food wasn't as refined as what she'd had at her reception 30 years earlier. When Tom stood to give his best man's speech, Linda actually stood up beside him, raising her champagne glass and announcing that she had a few words to say as well. The room fell silent as she launched into an impromptu speech that started with congratulations, but quickly devolved into thinly veiled warnings about the challenges of marriage. She told the assembled guests that marriage was hard work, that many couples today gave up too easily when things got difficult. She mentioned how young Michael and I were, how we had so much to learn about compromise and sacrifice. She shared statistics about divorce rates she'd apparently memorized for the occasion, reminding everyone that first marriages had less than a 50% success rate. But the moment that still makes my blood run cold was when she looked directly at Michael and me, raised her glass higher, and announced to the entire reception that she hoped we'd prove her wrong, but she honestly didn't think this marriage would last. She said it with a smile, like she was making a lighthearted joke, but the words hung in the air like poison gas. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the catering staff stopped moving, frozen in place as they processed what they'd just heard. Michael's face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale green that suggested he might actually be sick. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my body, unable to believe that my own mother had just publicly predicted the failure of my marriage at my wedding reception. Carol, Michael's mother, finally broke the silence by standing up and proposing a toast to love, commitment, and the bright future ahead of us. Her voice was steady and warm, but her eyes were blazing with a fury I'd never seen from such a gentle woman. The rest of the guests gratefully joined in, desperate to move past the uncomfortable moment Linda had created. But the damage was done. The remainder of the reception felt forced, like everyone was performing happiness while processing what they'd witnessed. The dancing was subdued, conversations felt strained, and I noticed several guests leaving earlier than planned. Even our photographer seemed rattled, missing several key moments, because he was distracted by Linda's continued attempts to insert herself into every shot. Linda spent the rest of the evening holding court with anyone who would listen, explaining her perspective on modern marriage and sharing unsolicited advice about relationships. She cornered several of Michael's relatives, warning them about the difficulties young couples face and expressing her concerns about our compatibility. She was sabotaging my marriage in real time, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone who'd come to celebrate with us. The final straw came during the bouquet toss. As all the single women gathered behind me, Linda suddenly appeared in the crowd, pushing her way to the front with claims that technically, since she was divorced, she qualified as single. The sight of my mother in her white dress, arms outstretched to catch my bouquet while surrounded by women decades younger than her, was surreal enough to break something inside me. I turned my back to the crowd and threw the bouquet as hard as I could toward the opposite side of the room, deliberately ensuring that Linda couldn't catch it. The flowers sailed over everyone's heads and landed on an empty table, where they sat like an accusation for the rest of the evening. Michael and I barely spoke during the drive to our hotel that night. We were supposed to fly to Savannah the next morning for our honeymoon, but the silence between us felt like a chasm that a romantic getaway couldn't bridge. When we finally talked, it wasn't about the beautiful ceremony or the love we'd pledged to each other. It was about Linda, about her behavior, about what it meant for our future together. Michael was hurt and angry, feeling like his family had been disrespected and embarrassed. He couldn't understand why I'd allowed Linda to behave that way, why I hadn't stood up to her, or asked someone else to intervene. I found myself defending her again, explaining that confronting her would have only made things worse, that creating a scene would have ruined the day more completely than her dress had. But as I spoke, I realized how tired I sounded, how many times I'd made similar excuses for Linda's behavior over the years. Michael was hearing it all for the first time, and his shock at what he'd witnessed was making me see my family through fresh eyes. The constant drama, the need for attention, the complete disregard for other people's feelings. It had all become so normal to me that I'd stopped recognizing how abnormal it really was. The honeymoon in Savannah was beautiful on the surface. We stayed at a historic inn in the heart of the city, took carriage rides through moss-draped squares, and ate incredible food at restaurants tucked into centuries-old buildings. But underneath the romance, we were both processing what had happened at our wedding, and the conversations we needed to have kept getting postponed in favor of maintaining the facade that everything was fine. When we returned home to Westerville, the wedding photos were waiting for us. Dave had done his best to minimize Linda's presence, but she was still visible in nearly every shot. The formal portraits looked like they featured two brides, the ceremony photos captured her dramatic expressions and attention-seeking gestures, and the reception pictures documented her various performances throughout the evening. Looking at those photos, I finally understood what Linda had accomplished. She'd managed to insert herself so completely into our wedding that it was impossible to remember the day without remembering her. Every anniversary, every time we looked at our wedding album, every story we told about our special day would include Linda and her white dress and her prediction about our marriage. The real damage, though, wasn't to the photos or the memories. It was to Michael's perception of my family and my willingness to set boundaries with them. Over the following months, Linda's behavior at the wedding became a recurring theme in our arguments. Michael felt like I'd chosen protecting my mother's feelings over protecting our marriage, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Linda continued her campaign of undermining our relationship after the wedding, calling frequently with concerns about our compatibility and sharing articles about divorce statistics and marriage counseling. She developed a habit of asking pointed questions about our relationship during family dinners, wondering aloud if we were really as happy as we claimed to be. When we started having normal newlywed adjustments, disagreements about money and housework and whose family to visit for holidays, Linda positioned herself as a sympathetic ear for my complaints. She'd listen to my frustrations with a knowing expression and remind me that she'd tried to warn me marriage was difficult. She never said outright that I should leave Michael, but she planted suggestions like seeds, watering them with doubt and fertilizing them with criticism. The breaking point came 8 months after the wedding, during a particularly stressful period when Michael was working long hours and I was struggling with a demanding new job. We were both exhausted and short-tempered, snapping at each other over trivial things and spending more time apart than together. It was a rough patch, the kind that every marriage goes through, but Linda treated it like vindication of her wedding day prediction. During one of our weekly phone calls, she suggested that maybe I'd rushed into marriage too quickly, that perhaps I needed to consider whether I was really happy or just trying to prove her wrong. She reminded me that there was no shame in admitting a mistake, that plenty of people realized they weren't compatible after living together for a while. I found myself actually considering her words, wondering if she might be right about Michael and me. The constant drip of her criticism had worn down my confidence in our relationship, making me question feelings and decisions that had once seemed certain. When Michael came home that night to find me crying in the kitchen, I couldn't even explain what was wrong without revealing how much my mother's opinions were influencing my emotional state. That conversation with Michael was the beginning of the end. He realized that Linda's sabotage hadn't stopped with the wedding, that she was actively working to undermine our marriage from the inside. He gave me an ultimatum that felt harsh at the time but was probably necessary. Either I set firm boundaries with Linda and protected our relationship from her interference, or he was done trying to build a life with someone who wouldn't defend their marriage from attack. I tried to set those boundaries, really tried. I asked Linda to stop commenting on our relationship, to keep her concerns to herself unless I specifically asked for advice. But she couldn't help herself. Every conversation still included subtle digs about Michael or marriage in general. Every family gathering featured her making pointed observations about couples she knew who were struggling or getting divorced. The final explosion came during Easter dinner at Linda's house. Michael and I had been working on our issues, attending couples counseling, and making real progress in our communication. We arrived at dinner feeling closer than we had in months, holding hands and genuinely enjoying each other's company. Linda took one look at us and made a comment about how nice it was to see us putting on such a good show for the family. When Michael asked what she meant, she said she could tell we were having problems despite our attempts to hide it, that she had a sixth sense about these things. She launched into a detailed analysis of our body language and facial expressions, explaining to the entire family why she believed our marriage was failing. Michael finally lost his temper. He told Linda exactly what he thought of her behavior, starting with the wedding dress and continuing through 8 months of constant interference and criticism. He said she was a toxic person who couldn't stand to see other people happy, that she'd deliberately sabotaged our wedding and was continuing to sabotage our marriage out of some twisted need for attention and control. The room erupted. Linda burst into tears, claiming she was only trying to help, that she loved us both and wanted us to be happy. Robert tried to mediate, suggesting that everyone calm down and discuss things rationally. Jessica and Kevin took sides, with Jessica defending Linda and Kevin surprisingly supporting Michael's position. But the damage was done. As we drove home that night, Michael and I both knew something fundamental had shifted. He'd finally seen Linda's manipulation clearly and called it out, but doing so had created a permanent rift in my family. I was faced with choosing between my husband and my mother, and the fact that it was even a choice revealed how dysfunctional the situation had become. I chose Michael, but it was too late. The constant stress of dealing with Linda's interference had eroded something essential in our relationship. We tried counseling, tried taking space from my family, tried rebuilding our connection from scratch. But the foundation had been poisoned from the beginning, tainted by Linda's white dress, and her prediction, and her relentless campaign to prove herself right. We separated that fall and divorced the following spring. Linda had won, though victory looked different than she'd probably imagined. She got to be right about our marriage not lasting, but she also lost her daughter in the process. I moved to a different city, took a new job, and built a life that didn't include family dinners, or weekly phone calls, or constant criticism disguised as concern. The last time I saw Linda was at the courthouse when our divorce was finalized. She'd come to offer support, she said, though I suspected she was there to witness her vindication. She was wearing white again. A simple dress that was appropriate for the occasion, but still managed to draw attention to herself. As I signed the papers that ended my marriage, Linda squeezed my shoulder and whispered that she was sorry she'd been right about Michael and me. She said she'd hoped we'd prove her wrong, but sometimes a mother's intuition was unfortunately accurate. Even in that moment, she couldn't resist taking credit for predicting our failure, couldn't acknowledge her role in causing it. Looking back now, 2 years after the divorce, and 3 years after that white dress walk down the aisle at St. Mary's Church, I can see the pattern clearly. Linda didn't predict that my marriage would fail. She engineered its failure, systematically undermining our relationship from the wedding day forward until her prophecy became self-fulfilling. She was right that the marriage wouldn't last, but not because she had any special insight into Michael's and my compatibility. She was right because she made sure it wouldn't last, because she couldn't tolerate being peripheral to my happiness, because she needed to be the center of attention even if it meant destroying her daughter's marriage to get there. The white dress was never about fashion or making a statement about traditional wedding etiquette. It was about establishing dominance, about making sure everyone knew who really controlled the narrative of my life. And in the end, she succeeded completely. My wedding day became her performance, my marriage became her battleground, and my divorce became her victory. But here's what Linda didn't anticipate. Losing my marriage also meant losing my tolerance for her manipulation. Walking away from Michael meant walking away from the entire toxic dynamic that had enabled her behavior for decades. She proved that my marriage wouldn't last, but in doing so, she proved that I was strong enough to recognize manipulation and walk away from it, even when it came from family. So yes, my mother wore white to my wedding and announced that my marriage wouldn't last. And yes, she was absolutely right. But not for the reasons she claimed, and not with the outcome she expected. She destroyed my marriage, but in the process, she set me free from a lifetime of her control. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to play the game anymore. The months following my divorce were a masterclass in understanding the difference between solitude and loneliness. I'd moved to Cincinnati, far enough from Riverside to require intentional effort for visits, but close enough that I couldn't claim geographic impossibility when family events arose. My new apartment was a studio in a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures, the kind of space that looked deliberately unfinished and cost twice what a suburban house would have run me back home. Linda called every Sunday like clockwork, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and satisfaction that I was only now learning to recognize. She'd ask about my job at the marketing firm, whether I was eating enough, if I'd met anyone new. But underneath the maternal inquiries was something else. A barely concealed smugness that whispered, "I told you so," with every breath. During one particularly memorable conversation, she mentioned that she'd run into Carol at the grocery store. Michael's mother had apparently asked about me, wondered how I was adjusting to single life. Linda had taken it upon herself to share that I was struggling with the transition, that divorce was harder on women than people realized, that she worried I'd made a mistake in giving up on the marriage so quickly. The audacity of that statement still takes my breath away. Linda had spent 8 months systematically dismantling my relationship, planting doubts and feeding criticism, until the foundation crumbled, and now she was rewriting history to position herself as the concerned mother who'd tried to save a doomed union. She'd become the hero of her own narrative, the wise woman who'd seen the truth when everyone else was blinded by romance. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Martinez, partly because my insurance covered it, and partly because I was tired of carrying conversations with Linda around in my head for days afterward. Our sessions took place in a cozy office, filled with plants and soft lighting, the kind of space designed to make you feel safe enough to examine uncomfortable truths. Dr. Martinez had a way of asking questions that seemed simple on the surface, but revealed layers of complexity underneath. When I told her about the wedding, she focused less on Linda's dress choice and more on my response to it. She wanted to know why I'd decided to let it happen, why protecting Linda's feelings had seemed more important than protecting my own comfort on my wedding day. The answer, when I finally found it, was both simple and devastating. I'd been trained since childhood to manage Linda's emotions, to smooth over her dramatic moments and minimize the impact of her behavior on others. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that my job was to make Linda look reasonable by absorbing the unreasonable parts of her personality and presenting them to the world as normal family dynamics. Dr. Martinez introduced me to terms like emotional parentification and narcissistic family systems. She explained how children in dysfunctional families often become caretakers for their parents' emotional needs, sacrificing their own development to maintain family stability. The education was both liberating and heartbreaking, like finally getting a diagnosis for symptoms you'd lived with your entire life without understanding their cause. One breakthrough came when she asked me to describe what I'd wanted my wedding day to feel like, before Linda's interference. I found myself talking about quiet moments with Michael, about feeling surrounded by people who loved us, about the joy of publicly declaring our commitment to each other. The vision I painted was so different from what actually happened that I started crying in the middle of describing it, For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve not just the end of my marriage, but the loss of the wedding day I dreamed of. Linda hadn't just worn an inappropriate dress or made uncomfortable comments. She'd stolen something irreplaceable, turned what should have been the happiest day of my life into a performance of her own insecurities and need for attention. Around this time, I started noticing how differently I felt when Linda wasn't part of my daily emotional landscape. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried for years began to fade. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped bracing myself for criticism disguised as concern, stopped performing happiness to prove that I was fine despite her predictions about my life choices. The clarity was startling. Without Linda's voice in my ear telling me what was wrong with my decisions, I started making choices based on what I actually wanted, rather than what would minimize drama or prove her wrong. I took a pottery class, adopted a cat named Fitzgerald, started dating a colleague named David who made me laugh until my cheeks hurt. David was everything Michael wasn't, which probably wasn't a coincidence. Where Michael had been serious and traditional, David was spontaneous and unconventional. Where Michael had wanted to build a life that looked successful from the outside, David was more interested in building a life that felt authentic from the inside. Most importantly, David had no interest in managing my family relationships or being managed by them. When I finally told Linda about David, 6 months into our relationship, her reaction was predictably theatrical. She wanted to know everything about him, his job, his family background, his intentions toward me. She expressed concern that I was rebounding too quickly, that I hadn't given myself enough time to heal from my divorce before jumping into something new. But this time, I recognized the manipulation for what it was. Linda wasn't concerned about my emotional well-being. She was threatened by my happiness, afraid that someone else might become more important to me than her opinions were. Her questions weren't coming from love, but from a need to maintain control over my narrative. I told her that my relationship with David was private, that I appreciated her concern but wouldn't be discussing the details with her. The silence that followed was loaded with surprise and disapproval. Linda wasn't accustomed to being shut out of any aspect of my life, and she clearly didn't like this new development. The real test came when she announced that she was planning to visit Cincinnati for my birthday. In the past, this would have sent me into a frenzy of apartment cleaning and itinerary planning, trying to orchestrate the perfect visit that would leave Linda no room for criticism. This time I told her that wouldn't work for me, that I already had plans and wouldn't be available to host her. Linda's response was swift and predictable. She reminded me that she was my mother, that family should come first, that she'd driven 4 hours to see me for my last birthday and had never asked for anything in return. She questioned whether David was influencing my priorities, whether I was letting a new relationship come between me and my family. The old me would have caved, would have canceled my plans with David, and spent my birthday managing Linda's emotions and listening to her subtle criticisms about my life choices. But the new me, the one who'd been learning about boundaries and emotional manipulation in therapy, held firm. I told Linda that I appreciated her wanting to celebrate with me, but that this visit wouldn't work, and she needed to respect that decision. What happened next was enlightening and horrifying in equal measure. Linda proceeded to have what Dr. Martinez would later describe as an extinction burst, the psychological term for when someone escalates their problematic behavior, when their usual tactics stop working. She called me 17 times in 2 days, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about how worried she was, how unlike me this behavior was, how concerned she was about my mental health. She enlisted Jessica and Kevin to call me, expressing their concern about how I was treating our mother. She reached out to mutual friends from high school, asking if they'd noticed changes in my personality or behavior. She even called my office, claiming there was a family emergency and she needed to speak with me immediately. The performance was exhausting and revealing. Linda was willing to harass me, involve other people in our conflict, and lie about family emergencies, rather than simply accept that I'd set a boundary she didn't like. Her need to control my decisions was so strong that my refusal to comply triggered a full-scale emotional meltdown. Through it all, David was a steady presence. He didn't try to fix the situation or offer advice about how to handle Linda. He just listened when I needed to talk, distracted me when I needed a break from thinking about it, and reminded me that healthy families don't operate through manipulation and guilt. His calm response to Linda's chaos helped me see just how abnormal the dynamics I'd grown up with really were. The turning point came when Linda showed up at my apartment unannounced, having driven to Cincinnati despite my explicit request that she not visit. She arrived on a Saturday morning with flowers and my favorite cookies from the bakery back home, playing the role of the loving mother who'd come to check on her troubled daughter. When I answered the door and saw her standing there with her peace offerings and wounded expression, I felt something shift inside me, not toward forgiveness or reconciliation, but toward complete understanding of who Linda really was and what our relationship had always been. She wasn't there because she missed me or was genuinely concerned about my well-being. She was there because she couldn't tolerate not being the most important influence in my life. I didn't let her in. Instead, I stepped out into the hallway and told her that showing up after I'd asked her not to come was exactly the kind of behavior that was damaging our relationship. I explained that I needed space to build my own life without her constant input and criticism, that her inability to respect my boundaries was proving that the space was necessary. Linda tried every tactic in her arsenal. She cried, she apologized, she blamed her behavior on worry and love. She accused me of being cruel and ungrateful, of letting David turn me against my own family. She threatened to never speak to me again if I didn't stop this foolishness and let her into my apartment like a normal daughter would. But I'd heard all of these arguments before, and therapy had given me the tools to recognize them for what they were. Linda wasn't expressing love or concern. She was trying to regain control through emotional manipulation, using guilt and threats to force me back into the role of managing her feelings at the expense of my own needs. I told her that I loved her but couldn't have a relationship with her if she continued to refuse to respect my boundaries. I said that when she was ready to treat me like an adult whose decisions didn't require her approval, we could talk about rebuilding our connection. Until then, I needed her to stop calling, stop showing up, and stop involving other people in our conflict. Linda's final card was the one she'd been saving. She told me that I was making a mistake, that I'd regret pushing away the people who loved me, that someday I'd realize how much I needed my family and it might be too late. She said I was repeating the same patterns that had destroyed my marriage, choosing isolation over working through difficult relationships. The irony of that statement was breathtaking. Linda was accusing me of the exact behavior she'd modeled my entire life, the same inability to take responsibility for her actions that had poisoned my marriage and countless other relationships. She was projecting her own emotional dysfunction onto me while simultaneously demonstrating exactly why I needed distance from her. I went back inside my apartment and watched from the window as Linda sat in her car for nearly an hour, probably hoping I'd change my mind and invite her up. When she finally drove away, I felt something I'd never experienced before in relation to my mother. Not anger, not sadness, not guilt, but peace. The exhausting cycle of manipulation and resistance was finally broken, at least from my end. That was 18 months ago. Linda still sends occasional texts, birthday cards, and Christmas gifts, but she's stopped calling and hasn't attempted another surprise visit. Jessica tells me that Linda complains about my behavior to anyone who'll listen, painting herself as the devoted mother whose ungrateful daughter has cut her off for no reason. But here's what Linda doesn't understand, will probably never understand. I didn't cut her off to punish her or prove a point. I created distance because her presence in my life was incompatible with my mental health and happiness. The woman who wore white to my wedding and predicted its failure wasn't just wrong about Michael and me. She was toxic to every relationship she touched, including the one with her own daughter. David and I got engaged last month. When people ask about wedding plans, I tell them we're thinking small, intimate family only. By family, I mean the people who love us enough to let our day be about us, who can celebrate our happiness without needing to compete with it or control it. Linda won't be invited. Not because I'm still angry about the white dress or the failed marriage prediction, but because I've learned that some people are fundamentally incapable of supporting other people's joy. Some relationships are too costly to maintain, even when they're with family members who claim to love you. My mother was right that my first marriage wouldn't last, but she was wrong about everything else. She thought proving herself right would bring me back to her, would make me dependent on her wisdom and guidance again. Instead, it taught me that her love came with conditions that were too expensive for me to meet. These days, I plan weddings the way I plan everything else in my life. Carefully, intentionally, with clear boundaries, about who gets to participate and how. David and I will exchange vows surrounded by people who want nothing more than to witness our commitment to each other, who don't need our love story to be about them. Sometimes the best way to honor a prediction is to learn from why it came true in the first place. Linda said my marriage wouldn't last, and she was right. But she was right for all the wrong reasons, and recognizing that difference made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.